Your DNA test came back, and it said British and Irish, maybe a little Scandinavian, perhaps a trace of French. And you looked at that neat little pie chart and thought, is that really it? Is that the whole story of what I am? It is not. That pie chart is the polished, simplified, commercially convenient version of a history so violent, so layered, and so strange that if you actually understood what was sitting inside your genome right now, it would stop you cold. Because what scientists have now confirmed using ancient DNA pulled from real skeletons buried in real English soil is that at least 4 completely different peoples fought over this island across 1,000 years, and all 4 of them left biological evidence inside the living population that is measurable, traceable, and in some cases still shocking even to the researchers who found it. 2 brand new studies published in May 2026 have just reinforced the entire picture, analyzing DNA from the skeletal remains of British individuals from Roman and medieval times, and what they confirmed changes everything you thought you knew about who built these islands and who you actually descend from. We are going to walk through every single piece of it. Before any of the invasions, before any of the famous battles, before the Saxons and the Vikings and the Normans ever arrived, there was already a people on this island whose genetic signature is still the dominant paternal lineage in large parts of Britain and Ireland today. They are broadly called the Celts, but that word requires some unpacking because Celtic is not a single race with a single origin point. It is a culture, a family of languages, and a genetic pattern that came together across Atlantic Europe over thousands of years and arrived in the British Isles through one of the most dramatic population replacement events that ancient DNA science has ever documented. Around 2,400 years before the Common Era, a people associated with what archaeologists call the Bell Beaker culture crossed into Britain from the lower Rhine region of continental Europe. What happened next was not a gradual cultural exchange. It was not peaceful assimilation. The 2018 landmark study published in Nature, led by David Reich's team at Harvard, analyzed genome-wide data from over 400 ancient individuals and confirmed what had been suspected but never proven at that scale. Within roughly 300 years of the Bell Beaker people arriving, approximately 90% of the existing male population of Britain had been genetically replaced. The men who had built Stonehenge, who had dragged those enormous stones across hundreds of miles, whose civilization had been the defining presence on this island for centuries, their Y chromosome lineage was nearly wiped out in a few generations. Gone. Not assimilated slowly. Replaced at a speed that stunned researchers when the numbers came back. The incoming people carried a specific Y chromosome marker called R1b-L21. That marker is what geneticists now call the fingerprint of the Atlantic Celts. And here's the truly remarkable thing. That same marker is still the dominant paternal lineage across Ireland, Wales, Scotland, Cornwall, and large parts of Western England today. In the west of Ireland, R1b-L21 reaches frequencies of 80% or higher. In Wales, it dominates. In the Scottish Highlands, it has persisted at levels that have barely shifted despite every subsequent invasion that came afterward. These are not guesses. These are laboratory measurements taken from living people whose ancestors never left those regions. The Bell Beaker replacement happened over 4,000 years ago, and it is still the most genetically impactful event in the entire history of these islands. This is the oldest surviving blood on British soil. It predates every other migration in this story by more than 1,000 years. And for tens of millions of people alive right now, it is still running through them. Then came a question that historians argued about for over a century without being able to settle it. How many Anglo-Saxons actually came? Did they replace the existing Celtic British population, or did they simply move in on top of them, changing the culture and the language while leaving the biology mostly intact? One side of the argument said the Saxons were a small elite who transformed Britain culturally without transforming it genetically. The other side said they came in enormous numbers and fundamentally changed who was here. The argument went on for decades because the evidence was soft, until ancient DNA made it hard. In 2016, a team from the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute and the University of Adelaide published a study in Nature Communications that changed the terms of that argument permanently. They extracted whole genome sequences from 10 ancient individuals excavated near Cambridge in the east of England, ranging from the late Iron Age around 50 BCE to the Middle Anglo-Saxon period around 500 to 700 CE. Using a new analytical method that tracked rare genetic variants shared between ancient samples and hundreds of modern people across Britain and Europe, they produced a number specific enough to settle a debate that had been running for a century. Approximately 38% of the ancestry of the modern East English population traces directly back to Anglo-Saxon migrants. Not to the Romans who came before them, not to later arrivals. To the people who came from what is now the Netherlands and Denmark in the 5th and 6th centuries and never went home. 4 individuals from a cemetery at Oakington in Cambridgeshire told the story in miniature. 2 were genetically migrant Anglo-Saxons. 1 was a native Celtic Briton, One was a mixture of both, buried in the same ground within a generation or two of each other. Same cemetery, same soil, different origins. The conquest was not a clean sweep. It was contact, conflict, and eventually children who carried both bloodlines at once. Then, 6 years later, in September 2022, a far larger study arrived and blew the doors off what remained of the argument. A team led by Joscha Gretzinger at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published findings in Nature that nobody in the field had quite expected at that scale. They had sequenced genome-wide ancient DNA from 460 medieval northwestern Europeans, including 278 individuals from England, covering the period from roughly 200 to 1300 CE. It was the largest study of its kind ever conducted on early medieval Britain, and the number it produced stopped people cold. The early medieval individuals excavated from eastern and southern England, the people buried in Anglo-Saxon cemeteries with Anglo-Saxon grave goods, derived an average of 76% of their ancestry from the continental North Sea zone, not from the existing Celtic British population already living there, from the people who had crossed the water from what is now the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. 76% in a cemetery in English soil. What this confirmed, finally and without room for argument, is that the Anglo-Saxon migration was not a small elite movement. It was a genuine mass migration. Entire communities crossed the North Sea and settled in such numbers that, in parts of eastern England, they became the dominant genetic population within a few generations of arriving. And yet, the original British population did not vanish. The same study showed that modern English people today carry between 25 and 47% of their ancestry from those continental migrants, not 76%. The gap between those two numbers is the story of what happened over the centuries that followed. The indigenous Celtic British population, pushed back and outnumbered but never fully erased, gradually mixed back into the gene pool. The conquest diluted over time. The children of both peoples became one people, and the 2022 Max Planck study caught the moment before that blending had fully happened, frozen in bone and soil waiting 1,000 years to be read. Two new 2026 studies have reinforced this picture, analyzing DNA from the skeletal remains of British individuals who lived during Roman and medieval times, confirming that Britain's population history is characterized by long-term genetic continuity punctuated by episodes of significant migration, particularly during the early medieval period with substantial continental influx, and that major historical events, such as the Roman occupation and Norman Conquest, had minimal genetic impact on the broader population. Before we get to the Normans, we have to talk about the Vikings, because the Viking story is the one that commercial DNA tests handle most badly, and understanding why tells you something important about what your results are actually hiding from you. It started on the 8th of June, 793 CE, on a small holy island off the northeast coast of England called Lindisfarne. The monastery there was one of the most important centers of Christian scholarship in the entire kingdom of Northumbria. It held manuscripts, gold, sacred objects, and monks who had spent their lives in quiet study. According to the Anglo-Saxon chronicle, ships appeared without warning. The church was ransacked. Some monks were killed, some were taken, some were thrown into the sea. What arrived that morning at Lindisfarne was not an isolated criminal act. It was the opening move in a 300-year relationship between the British Isles and Scandinavia that would permanently alter the genetics of the North. The Vikings did not stay raiders. Within a century of Lindisfarne, Danish forces had conquered an enormous swathe of northern and eastern England. A peace agreement struck between the West Saxon King Alfred and the Danish leader Guthrum in the late 9th century formalized what had already become reality on the ground. Half of England was now operating under Scandinavian law. The region became known as the Danelaw, and it stretched from the Thames northward, absorbing Yorkshire, East Anglia, and the East Midlands into a zone of Norse custom, Norse justice, and Norse settlement. The place names left behind are still there today. Any English town ending in by, such as Derby, Grimsby, or Whitby, is a Norse word for settlement. Any town ending in Thorpe is from the Norse for village. The Vikings did not just raid Britain, they named it. The genetics that followed centuries later confirmed exactly what those place names had been suggesting all along. The landmark People of the British Isles study, published in Nature in 2015, led from Oxford University and analyzing over 2,000 people from across the UK, found that the population of Orkney stood completely apart from every other British genetic cluster. About 25% of the Orkney people's genes traced directly to Norwegian Vikings, and the Orkney Islands were Norwegian territory for 600 years. Norwegian genetic contributions were also detectable across all Scottish samples into Northern Ireland, and less strongly into Northern England. The same study found that the Norse did not simply replace the existing Pictish population of Orkney, they married into it. The raiding eventually stopped. The relatives stayed. In September 2020, a research team led by Professor S.K. Willerslev of Cambridge University and the University of Copenhagen published the largest ancient DNA study of the Viking world ever attempted. They sequenced the genomes of 442 Viking-era skeletons from archaeological sites scattered across Europe and Greenland, a 6-year project that produced findings blunt enough to make headlines in every major science publication on Earth. One of those findings concerned the modern British population directly. According to the study published in Nature, up to 6% of people in the UK carry identifiable Viking DNA in their genes today. In Sweden, one of the Viking homelands, the figure is 10%. Britain, a country the Vikings raided, conquered, and settled for 3 centuries, carries more than half the Scandinavian rate. That 6% is not a small number. Across the entire UK population, that is roughly 4 million living people walking around right now with measurable Viking ancestry in their genome. But here's the problem. Open your DNA results from any major commercial testing company, and you will almost certainly not see it labeled that way. When companies like 23andMe or Ancestry DNA analyze your genome, they work by comparing your DNA segments against databases of modern reference populations. 1,000 years of intermarriage across the British Isles has thoroughly blended Norse, Saxon, and Celtic contributions together. Your Norse ancestry from a 10th century ancestor in Yorkshire is not labeled Viking on your results screen. It is quietly folded into the British and Irish percentage. It sits there without a flag on it, statistically invisible unless you know where to look. Where you actually look for it is the Y chromosome haplogroup, available to any man who orders a dedicated Y DNA test through a specialist company. Specific haplogroups, particularly I1 and certain subclades of R1A with documented Scandinavian distribution, are far more informative for Norse ancestry than any autosomal percentage pie chart. They trace a single, unbroken paternal line back through time in a way that a blended ethnicity estimate fundamentally cannot do. Now, the 4th bloodline, the most historically dramatic, the most thoroughly documented in the written record, and by a considerable margin, the least detectable in the actual DNA of the ordinary English population. And on the 14th of October, 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, defeated the English King Harold at the Battle of Hastings. The consequences on paper were total. Within 20 years, the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy of England had been stripped almost entirely of their land and replaced by Norman lords. The Domesday Book, commissioned by William at Christmas 1085 and completed in 1086, recorded the result in meticulous Latin. Every acre, every mill, every estate, and 13,000 settlements across England catalogued under its new Norman owner. Of roughly 1,100 tenants-in-chief recorded in that survey, the overwhelming majority held French names. The Old English landowning class had been replaced in a single generation. It was the most thorough top-down seizure of property in English history. And yet, when geneticists went looking for the Norman Conquest in the DNA of the English people, they found almost nothing. A study posted in April 2026, led by Flavio De Angelis of Arizona State University, examined genome-wide ancient DNA from 78 individuals buried at a cemetery in Godalming, Surrey, a site in continuous use from the 9th to the early 13th century, spanning the conquest directly. Radiocarbon dating allowed researchers to split the individuals into those who died before 1066 and those who died after it. The question was simple: does the Norman Conquest show up in the bones of ordinary English people? The answer was no. When researchers compared the genome-wide ancestry profiles of pre-conquest and post-conquest burials, there was no detectable genetic break at all. The same North Sea ancestry pattern persisted completely unchanged across the 1066 divide. A separate and larger analysis of over 1,000 ancient British genomes, led by Marina Silva at the Francis Crick Institute, reached the identical conclusion. The conquest, for all its documented political violence, was what geneticists now call an elite replacement event. A relatively small number of Norman lords took the land and the titles. The people already farming that land barely moved. Their bloodlines carried on completely undisturbed beneath the new French-speaking surface above them. About 80% of the individuals who lived during Roman times in Britain cluster almost exactly with those of the immediately preceding Iron Age, arguing for genetic continuity and no replacement, and Wales and Ireland retain stronger continuity with earlier populations, while England shows clearer evidence of ancestry linked to early medieval migration from Northern Europe, and Scotland occupies an intermediate position, reflecting both long-term continuity and later Scandinavian influence. Now let us talk about what the most detailed genetic map ever produced for a single country actually shows, because this is where the data gets precise in a way that should genuinely surprise you. In March 2015, a team led by Peter Donnelly at the Wellcome Trust Center for Human Genetics in Oxford published what became the most detailed genetic portrait ever assembled for any country on Earth. The people of the British Isles study analyzed the DNA of 2,039 people, drawn from rural areas across the UK. Each participant had all 4 grandparents born within 80 kilometers of each other, which meant the researchers were effectively sampling the British population as it existed before the large-scale industrial movements of the 20th century. They were reading the land itself rather than the modern mixed-up version of it. What the map showed was extraordinary in its precision. At the broadest level, the British Isles separate into 2 populations, Orkney against everyone else. Zoom in further and Wales forms its own distinct genetic island, then splits again into North Wales and South Wales. Then Cornwall pulls away from the rest of England. Then the north of England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland each separate from the south. By the time the analysis reached its finest resolution, the researchers had identified 17 genetically distinct clusters across the entire country, each one corresponding with striking accuracy to historical boundaries, ancient kingdoms, and the paths of migrations that happened over 1,000 years ago. The Welsh clusters carry the oldest genetic signal in Britain. The research team described the Welsh as more similar to the earliest post-Ice Age settlers of Britain than any other population in the country. The Welsh genetic profile has been sitting in approximately the same place, with approximately the same characteristics, for longer than any other surviving population on these islands. The Anglo-Saxon contribution, almost entirely absent from Wales, is clearly visible across eastern, central, and southern England, with the study estimating it at between 10 and 40% of total ancestry in that broad Saxon heartland. The Orkney cluster, the most genetically distinct in the entire data set, carries its 25% Norwegian signature like a flag that has never been lowered regardless of what happened politically around it. The map does not lie. Where your family has lived for generations is not just a postcode. It is a genetic address that points directly back to which of these 4 peoples settled the ground first and held it long enough to pass their blood to you. Your surname has been carrying part of this message the entire time most people have simply never been taught how to read it. Look at the son endings first. Johnson, Robertson, Wilson, Williamson, Henderson, Stevenson. These patronymic surnames, built by attaching the suffix son to the father's given name, are especially concentrated in northern England and Scotland. This was precisely the Old Norse custom. Norse settlers in the Danelaw regions of northern and eastern England built surnames exactly this way, and the practice became so embedded in local usage that it crystallized into hereditary family names as Britain's surname system solidified between roughly 1100 and 1400 CE. If your family name ends in son and your roots are in Yorkshire, Northumbria, or the Scottish lowlands, that suffix is not an accident of the English language. It is a linguistic fossil from a Scandinavian settlement that happened over 1,000 years ago and never fully went away. Now look at the Mac and Mac prefixes: MacDonald, MacGregor, Mackenzie, MacPherson, MacLeod. The Mac prefix in both Scottish Gaelic and Irish Gaelic means son of, and it is one of the oldest continuous naming conventions still visible in British surnames today. These names mark the Celtic line directly and cleanly. If your surname carries Mac or Mac, your patrilineal ancestry traces to the Gaelic-speaking Celtic world, Scotland, Ireland, or both. And that naming tradition has been unbroken for long enough that it predates every other invasion in this entire story. Then there are the French-edged surnames: Percy, Beaumont, Montgomery, Mortimer, Fitzwilliam, De Vere, Neville. The surname Percy derives from Percy en Auge in Normandy. Beaumont translates from the French for beautiful mountain, taken from a Norman estate. Montgomery traces back to Saint-Germain de Montgomery in Normandy. These names did not evolve organically in England. They arrived on horseback in 1066, were handed to the men who took the land, and were written into the Domesday Book. If your surname carries that French architecture, a Norman family once claimed your ancestry at sword point, recorded it in a census, and never fully relinquished the name even as the genetics beneath it remained stubbornly Anglo-Saxon and Celtic. Now let us be honest about what commercial DNA tests can and cannot show you. Most people open their results, look at the pie chart for 30 seconds, and close the tab. That is the least informative possible way to use what you have already paid for. The standard ethnicity estimate from 23andMe, or Ancestry DNA, is built from autosomal DNA, meaning it looks at your entire genome and compares segments against modern reference populations. The category labeled British and Irish accounts for the majority of what you see if your ancestry is from these islands. But, as everything covered in this video makes clear, that single category is hiding a layered history spanning 4 completely distinct peoples across 4 different eras of migration and settlement. The most informative single tool for tracing which of the 4 peoples runs through your paternal line is the Y chromosome haplogroup, available to any man who orders a dedicated Y DNA test through a specialist company like Family Tree DNA. Here's what you're looking for. If your Y DNA haplogroup is R1b-L21 or any of its downstream subclades, your direct paternal line is Celtic, the oldest surviving blood on these islands, dominant in Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and the west of England, and tracing back to the Bell-Beaker migration more than 4,000 years ago. If your result is R1b U106, the Germanic branch, your paternal line points toward the Anglo-Saxon migration, the people who came from the Netherlands and Denmark in the 5th and 6th centuries. If your haplogroup is I1 or a Scandinavian associated subclade of R1a, your direct paternal line is Norse, the bloodline of the people who raided Lindisfarne, settled the Danelaw, and left 25% of their DNA in Orkney. If your family has been rooted in Wales, Cornwall, the Scottish Highlands, or the west of Ireland for generations, the oldest blood on these islands is almost certainly still moving through you. The Celtic signal carried in Y chromosome haplogroup R1b L21, and its downstream subclades has persisted in those regions at frequencies that none of the subsequent invasions came close to seriously disrupting. The people of the British Isles study confirmed it directly. The Welsh carry DNA closer to the original post-Ice Age settlers of Britain than any other population in the country. That is not sentiment or national mythology. That is a laboratory measurement. If your family roots lie in eastern, central, or southern England, the Anglo-Saxon contribution is substantial and measurable. Multiple studies now converge on a figure of roughly 25 to 40% continental Germanic ancestry for people from those regions, sitting on top of a pre-existing Celtic-British foundation that was never fully replaced. The genetic portrait of modern England is a genuine composite, the oldest Celtic layer underneath, the Saxon migration layered on top, both present in real proportions that vary by county and by individual family history. If your ancestry traces to the northern English counties, the Scottish lowlands, or the Northern Isles, Norse blood is part of the picture. Orkney sits at 25% Norwegian by direct genomic measurement. Northern England carries Norse linguistic fossils in its very place names. And the 2020 Cambridge and Copenhagen Viking study calculated that up to 6% of the entire UK population carries identifiable Viking DNA, unevenly distributed and heavily concentrated in exactly the regions that history tells us it should be. And the Normans, the fourth bloodline, the most historically dramatic and the least genetically detectable. They left their mark almost entirely in language and law, in the shape of English courts and property systems, and in surnames rather than in the genome of the ordinary population. If you carry a French-edged surname, that is your Norman evidence. The DNA beneath it belongs to whoever was already farming that ground when the Normans arrived and claimed the title to it. For most of human history, the question of who built these islands had no scientific answer. You had stories, you had surnames, you had the name of the village your grandparents came from and a general sense of belonging to a place without being able to say precisely what that place had made you at the cellular level. That is no longer true. Ancient DNA extracted from real skeletons, analyzed in real laboratories, published in Nature and confirmed across study after study over the past decade, has given us the receipts. The four peoples who fought over this island for 1,000 years left measurable, traceable, specific biological evidence inside the living population. It is sitting in your genome right now. The Celtic blood that predates every other migration by over 1,000 years, the Saxon blood that crossed the North Sea and built the language you are currently hearing, the Norse blood that soaked into the north and simply refuses to disappear, even after 1,000 years of intermarriage. The Norman fingerprint carried mostly in surnames and legal structures, rather than in the body itself, because the people who actually lived on this land through the conquest were already here and barely moved. None of these peoples ever really finished arriving. None of them ever fully left. What you are is the accumulated result of all four, in proportions that vary by county, by family, and by the 1,000 years of unquiet history that made this island what it is.